Hi, welcome to the Cyclekart diaries. This week I'm having a look at the louvers on the cart. See you in a minute. Okay, so it's time to address the last big unknown, I think, on the car and what's been the elephant in the room for a long while, and that is the fact that there are an awful lot of louvers on the body on an Austin 7 twin cam racer. Now, if I was using an aluminium body, it is possible to make dies to punch louvers out, but there's a further complication in that on the 7, the bonnet, which is quite steeply curved, has, in some of the versions, has louvers on the curve as well, and that in itself is another bit of a nightmare. So I've got a couple of options, I think. One of them is fake and one of them is a bit more real. Because I'm using this dye bond stuff on the body, which I think I'll stick to the 2mm because it's plenty rigid enough, I want to see if I can use the same principles as they're using on aluminium with this plastic and aluminium sheet. I've got no worries about the thin aluminium coating bending because it's so thin, it's like toothpaste tube. It's whether or not the plastic inside will take a mould with a punch, and I think probably heat might help on that. So I'm going to have an experiment with that, and if that works out, so far so good. I'll have to worry about curved louvers another day, but just getting louvers alone in this material would be a great step forward. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a slot with something, I don't know what yet, probably an angle grinder. Just cut a slot across, and then I'm going to make up a die which has got a vertical metal plate to go in that slot so that I'll get location every time, and a timber probably base at the moment. I'll probably just work with a bit of timber first and cut out effectively the shape of a louver underneath it, and then I'll have a punch from above which has got the shape of the louver to impress into it. Now, to get the shape into the die, I'm just going to use a quadrant sort of moulded cutter which gives that sort of a profile, and just come up slowly with it. I've marked the start and the finish where I want this thing to work from on a bit of timber, so I'm just going to start about there and run it, push it in, and then push it up to that point, and then stop it or pull it out and then move back. Just gradually bring the cutter up, and that should give me the shape of effectively the die for the louver. Well, that's got me a die shape, and all I need to do now is find something that is the width of the cut in the die bond that will be 4 inches wide. It'll stick up above that, and then I can make a corresponding male shape that slightly smaller than that, and it'll just push down into that or hammer down into that, and it should give me a shape if it works. So I've made a rough jig up. This is not the finished job at all, but this is just to see if I can get what I want to get by way of a result. I'm not even sure if that's not too thick to go in there, but I thought I would at least see what happens when I take a big hammer and put that on there and push it in and see what happens. need a lot of work, but it does look like it might work. I don't know. Interesting. It doesn't take the blow very well, and it is quite a thick, although it's only 2mm, it's probably going to be too thick, I think. So maybe we'll have to have a rethink on anything which is got louvers in it. Yeah, not convinced. Okay, so it's time to get on with the louvers, having failed dismally in punching them out in dye bond. It's a material which is basically too thick, and it's not going to produce the result I want. It's not flexible enough to be able to punch the louvers out with, and for reasons I'll get on to, it's not just as easy as making a punch. I've got to probably end up making a dozen if I need to do anything. So I'm adopting the principle that I adopt with a lot of things when I'm in a situation like this. If at first you don't succeed, cheat. And that is to go down a route that partially a route that many of the other Cyclekart guys are using, and that is to use somebody else's louvers as a starting point. Now you can buy these things, air conditioning grills and all sorts, and I've seen them used a lot. People just cut them into the section that they need, stick them on the side, and then fair it in with body filler or whatever around the edge. And that would be a valid reason, route for me to go down, no problem at all, were it not for two things. And they're the two problems that I alluded to when I was on about the making of punches, albeit in dye bond or in aluminium. The bonnet of the Austin 7 is about that radius. And so the first problem you have is that when you try and bend a louver, it just flattens out in the middle, because you're trying to make the inner radius smaller than the outer radius, and in this instance it's just not going to work. So that's a problem number one. If I was punching them out in aluminium, you would need, if you were hand working it, you'd need to make something which would cope with that radius and the fact that it's actually tapering as well as curved. And I'm just not into that. I'm not a tool maker, I'm not an aluminium worker, and I'm not going to start on something like this just for that. And the other problem is that on the Austin 7 there are a lot of instances where there are sets of louvers that taper. So at one end you've got louvers that are probably only that long, but then they just gradually, as you move along to avoid a cutout or something, the louvers get bigger or longer. So that left me with a bit of a problem really as to how to get round it. I could have just ignored it altogether. Some of the very early Austin 7s didn't have any louvers on the bonnet, so I could have gone just with flat louvers on the side here and there, but it still wasn't really an ideal solution. So I've turned to the area where I've probably got more expertise, and that is the model making. What I've got is some RTV silicone moulding material. It's room temperature vulcanizing silicone, about a 10% mix, and it's like any other resin. You pour the two parts together, catalyst and the resin, and it will then form into whatever you pour it onto. I'll use these as a mould. I will fill the back of the slot in, but leave the filler in just slightly back from the front edge, so that you actually do get a small hollow in there, because this stuff will follow that sort of contouring. And the material that I'm going to use to pour the actual louvers will also go into extremely fine gaps. It should be okay, and I don't think it'll be too fragile to use them. This is the sort of thing I use it for. This is a cab for a model railway loco, tram loco. that there's two parts to that mould, but you put the two halves together and pour the material in, and then you strip it out, and you've got yourself a representation of what your master was in the first place. And this stuff is incredibly good at picking up the finest detail. I have in the past found my fingerprints on models that I've cast and realised that it's because it was on the master, and it's then been picked up by the mould, and it's then come out on the casting as well. So it will pick up really fine detail, not that it's needed on this. I use a 2-part epoxy resin to pour into the mould when that's done, and that has two advantages. First and foremost, it sets in about 2 or 3 minutes at most once you pour it, but it remains plastic for probably 20 minutes or so, so it means I can strip them out of the mould and place them on a curved surface, and they will take up that surface, and then they will harden completely and fully afterwards, and then at that point I'll either stick them on or drill from the back and put a small screw in or something to fix them. The other thing is that the resin is very much like a plastic in material when it's hardened, so it means that I can cast a load of louvers and then cut them in half and take 10, 20, 30 millimeters out and glue them back together again, so that for my tapered louvers I can custom make them, glue them back together, sand them up, and again you'll never know that there's been a difference in that. So I think that's the way I'm going forward. I've got the material, just going to make up a mould box for these to do probably 4. I'll probably just do 4 of them. Now I've separated the one of the rows of 4 louvers, just basically scored it with a knife and bent it. It's fairly thin, and I've cut some very thin pieces of plastic card, which is something I use a lot with the railway modelling, and essentially I'm just putting that in just to lie slightly back from the front edge of the louver, just putting a tiny spot of cyano on it to locate it at either end. Spot in the middle, and what that does, that sets the face of the plastic just back from the edge, from the lip there. And what I've also done, I've got some very small, it's actually N-gauge brickwork, but it's just a very small pattern on the plastic, which hopefully when it's painted black will give the impression that there's a gauze behind as well. That's got the mould box made. I just used the cheap, you can buy like a Lego clone from Wilko's in the UK. It's much cheaper. You just go and grab a handful and you pay for it by a bucket full or whatever. I use the little thin ones as a base layer first around anything, then that's sealed to the sort of substrate. In this case I'm using a bit of dye bond, and then build up the sides as deep as you need with the blocks. So it's time to mix this up and get it into the mould, and the unknown always is how much you need, but if you on slightly on the cautious side, and you can always add more in later on, and with a 10-to-1 mix we'll have a go. And as before with the glass fibre, I'm going to mix up with the scales, in kitchen scales, in a paper bag, in a plastic bag. And as this is what, 250ml, something like that. No, it's a kilogram. So we'll start with probably half a pot full, see what that comes out at. That's just over 100 grams. 106. So we need 10 grams of catalyst now in that, which is sealed on, sealed lid. As I say, this is the first time I've used this stuff. Looks like it needs shaking up first, although I think it's only a colouring agent, just so that you can see how well you've got the mix carried out. I don't think it forms a part of the actual catalysing process. So, wow, it's a bit bright. That's about right. That will give a reason for using the plastic bag, because I've spilt it all over what would have been the scales. Saved them that trauma. Just mix it up a bit now. I'm not used to quite such a violent colour. As I said before, everything I've done in the past has been a pastel blue. The working time on this is much longer than with the glass fibre. You've probably got about 25 minutes, I would guess, 45 minutes working time with this, so it's a much more leisurely occupation. That's it. So when we got that mixed up well and truly, just pour it into the mould and leave it to find its own level and see whether we need any more or not. Might just stick another 50 ml in, just to 50 grams, just to lift it slightly higher. It just makes the mould a little bit more strong. And here we are, less than 24 hours later. I did this about 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. It's 10:30 now. It's gone hard, I think, hard enough, I think. I'm going to strip the mould and then see whether or not we can cast. Now the only doubt is that I've got some resin, but it's got a sell-by date that's 4 years ago. It has been kept in the house in good condition, totally unsealed containers, so I'm hopeful, because if not, it's 20 quid a throw. So as you can see, you just strip the mould out with these little Lego bricks, or Lego type bricks. You can see there's been a certain amount of seepage through the gaps, but it's not anything that is significant. Not sure some of those haven't stuck to the base. Anyway, we'll see if we can get the mould off first. And there we go. That has given us what we want. That's the mould. Maybe a little bit of cleaning up, I don't know, we'll see. So, next job is to try a cast, and I want to make sure that the back is flat. So I've got some acetate sheet that I use, which doesn't stick to the resin, so that will lie on top of the resin and get it a decent flat back. There's just a bit of run. I was going to say there's something wrong with the resin there, but it's just a little bit of stuff that's seeped under the edge. You can see it's like a rubber, it comes out. Tends to harden a bit with use, because there's heat generated when you pour the resin. So I've got I've got two actually, piece of resin, stuff there, I need something like a polythene type pot to mix in, so pop in the house and get that. Right, let's got those. So let's have a look at the resins there. It's a Cyclekart product. It's a mix of 1:1 by, I think, weight, although I use volume, and I don't think it's desperately critical. There's a resin and a hardener. The hardener is G26 Cyclekart by resin. The resin itself you can use, I think there's G26, G27 and G27 LV. I use the LV because the LV stands for low viscosity, and it means it's almost like water when it goes in to the mould, and will therefore fill any sort of tiny, like the little edges of the louvers. It means it's going to fill that very well. One thing I never do is to have two lids open at once, because you're likely to put the wrong lid on the wrong jar, and then you get into all sorts of trouble with the hardener setting material. I'm just going to try with 20 ml. So we'll work on 20 millilitres or grams or whatever. Millilitres, aren't they? That's it. So I have a hardener, I have a resin, 1:1 mix, and you don't get much time with this. We're talking minutes rather than hours. And you will see, hopefully, the reaction that takes place pretty rapidly. So I pour the two bits in together, mix it up. Don't worry too much about bubbles in it, because again they'll tend to come to the surface, which in this case won't matter because it'll be at the bottom of the louver, which will be against the body of the car. So that's mixed those two together, and all I'm going to do now is just pour it into the mould. Probably far too much actually I've mixed, but you never know with these things. What I generally tend to try and do when I'm doing the model making is to have a spare mould with something that doesn't matter that I can use, because otherwise it's a bit of a waste. And I'm going to put that material on, and you'll see it just flashes across and gets rid of any air bubbles and that in the moulds. And then we leave it, and you will see, if it's going well, almost in front of your eyes this stuff will start to go milky cloudy and will go hard. Just thinking I might get a cap to mix this into, because otherwise it'll block up my mixing jug. Yes, I probably needed less than half that. As I say, it's an exothermic reaction. It generates heat, and the bigger the casting, the greater the heat and the faster it tends to go off, because of its generates its own heat that helps set it even more. We can see already that 2 minutes and a half later, in the stuff in the cap, because it's that much bigger mass, has already started to go and has gone milky white in colour, and there is quite a lot of heat coming out of that now at the bottom. Just to illustrate the temperature thing, the general sort of temperature of stuff in here, 17.5 degrees, 16.9, 17, 17.9, that resin 37. So there's 53 on the bottom, 49, 37, 42, 51, 53. So it's generating quite a lot of heat as it sets, and that one has gone solid now. That has still not even gone yet, so it's the same mix. just the size. This is now in quite a plastic state. It's solid, but you can bend it, and that's what I'm hoping to do, to catch this in this state when I'm doing the louvers, and that'll mean that we can drape them over a bonnet shape and get a result. So there you are, that's the cast piece, and as you can see, although it is a solid, it's in a situation at the moment where you can bend it around. That will eventually, give it a few more minutes, go to something that is quite solid. And this is now just starting to go, don't know whether you can see it from there, but there's starting to get a cloudiness in the resin. So it's taken a lot longer than it normally does, but because it's such a small amount, as you can see, that had gone a while ago. This has taken about 6 or 7 minutes, but it's now just starting to go, and presumably again we've got 22 degrees, 18, 19. Yeah, we haven't got the heat in here, you see. This is 24 degrees, so it's just not got enough mass to generate the conditions to make it set quicker. But we'll give it a few more minutes and we should be there. Strip the acetate sheet off. That should leave us, as I say, a smooth back on the resin. Doesn't last forever, I'll probably get 4 or 5 uses out of that and then we'll start again. So you can see the back of it now is smooth. Right, time to strip them out. See what we've got. Now, given that they're actually on a backing, they may even, because it's so thin, it may even be that you could literally just glue that on and it'll keep all the spacing. But that's got me exactly what I want. A set of louvers that I can repeat, that I can cut in half and make smaller, and that hopefully we'll see here that I can bend. These have gone a little bit too far, but at least you don't get the distortion with them when you bend them that you would get with the original, where you get that happening. Closes up the gap in there. And the only downside is that there is no clear route through to the body of the car, but I don't think you'll see it, I really don't, with paint, and you've got that thin edge still left. There is a clear step there that the resin seems to take up, and it's not particularly fragile. What I'll do is I think I'm going to glue these to a bit of dye bond, paint them up. I won't take too much effort in tidying up all this backing. I'm just going to glue the whole thing straight on, give it a spray, and we'll see what they look like when they're done. That's given them a coat of black on the inside, and it does, as I'd hoped, look a bit like a grill in there if you look really closely. But from anything more than probably, I don't know, 500mm, a couple of feet away, you're not going to notice it, I'm sure. But that gives me pretty much exactly what I want. I won't be using it on the backing because there is an edge that would need to be faired out, and quite frankly there's probably as much work in messing around with that as there is in actually doing individual louvers and applying them, I think, because it's not perfect, the flat bit between them. But as far as I'm concerned, that's a successful way forward, and so I'm really quite happy with that. It's got me exactly what I wanted to do. It's got me a means of producing louvers, means of producing curved louvers, and something that I don't have to worry about now. I can actually carry on making the rest of the bodywork in the plain panels of die bond, knowing that I can attach these things afterwards before it's painted. So that's got me where I wanted to be with the louvers, and I can carry on getting on with the rest of the cart now. I hope it was of interest. Look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be doing something different on the cart. Look forward to seeing you then. Bye!